So as always, we will be starting with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Lenni Lenape peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obligated to know the stories of dispossession that have allowed the University of Pennsylvania to grow and thrive on this vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we endeavor to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantle the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. I want to welcome everyone for coming to this very special event tonight. It's going to be a lecture / conversation, dialogue, and also a book launch. And we want to welcome Sue Ann Kahn for the launch of her book, Louis I. Kahn, The Last Notebook. She will be in conversation with Bill Whitaker, Curator and Collections Manager of the Penn Architectural Archives. Honoring the 50th anniversary of her father's death in March of 1974, Sue Ann Kahn published a facsimile edition of the architect's private notebook in which he sketched and wrote during his travels in the last year of his life. An artifact of historical importance, the notebook's pages give us an intimate glimpse into Kahn's creative process and takes us inside the mind of the master architect at the height of his career. Louis Kahn has left a lasting legacy with the University of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, which I don't need to go into because I think everyone knows his story very well. Sue Ann Kahn, daughter of Louis Kahn, has advocated for the preservation and restoration of her father's architecture for over 3 decades. She has also been an active consultant and significant lender to the major exhibitions of his work. Sue Ann inherited her father's notebooks after the death of her mother, Esther Kahn, in 1996. It was this one, his last notebook, that interested her the most and felt that this personal record should be shared with others. And that's why we have the book today. She enlisted the help of Bill Whitaker to identify what was depicted, confirmed that the notebook was used exclusively in the last year of her father's life and that the entries were chronological. Sam Lubell writes in the New York Times article, quote, eight revelations from Louis Kahn's last sketchbook. On its own, the recreated sketchbook, which duplicates the original's trim size, color, trace paper, and many empty pages, and even a small smear of ink on the cover, delivers an intimate reflection of and connection to an architect who could embed physical objects with deep feeling, carving out space, light, and spirit. The grace and clarity of his images and thoughts are amplified by the accuracy and tactility of the facsimile. You can tell how hard Kahn was pressing his pencil to craft a drawing, or how carefully or quickly he was trying to compose an idea. And I want to, of course, give a very warm welcome to Sue Ann, and also thank Bill Whitaker for helping us curate this, to be the curatorial consultant for this project. And also, Bill has served as curatorial consultant for Louis Kahn, The Power of Architecture, a major exhibition of architects' work organized by the Vitro Museum in 2012. He has also co-authored The House of Louis Kahn with George Marcus, the first comprehensive study of the architect's house design. But before I welcome them to the podium or to the 2 seats there, I want to first ask Adjunct Professor of Architecture Richard Farley to the podium to share his experience as a University of Pennsylvania MArch student who studied under Louis Kahn. I've heard about the story that he's about to tell us. It's very moving and really shows us the kind of influence that Kahn had in this school. So welcome Richard first.
All right, so heard those words, space, light, and spirit. And for the year of 1973, 1974, my life was circumscribed with that, studying with Lou. But I want to take a step back before we go there to a few years before. 500 students. This time of year, my good friend John Chase and I snuck out of studio to go up the stairs in Furness to be able to see one of the reviews, one of the juries that Kahn was giving. And as we turned the corner and started to go up the steps, we saw two men carrying a third man out, completely in tears and just distraught, and just shaking his head with tears popping up out of his eyes. And I looked at John, and I said, we've got to get in this studio. This is going to be great. So I flashed forward to the years we did get in. Yeah, we had to apply. We had to finish the MArch program first and then head on over, and we were both accepted. So I flashed forward to the exact same time when I'm in Kahn's studio in September. And late at night for the first charrette, appears at the side of my desk this attractive young blonde woman from the landscape architecture department who had a flat tire and she needed to get the bike fixed so she could go home and get some rest before she presented. So that's been my wife for the past 40 years. And I have 3 children that have all kind of grown up to be architects as well. And my wife, by the way, practiced, did a few projects with Harriet Patterson, who is a good, close associate of the whole Kahn thing. So the ties are just tremendous. But anyway, let's talk about what it was like to be in Kahn's studio. It was very special. You had to apply to it, and it was assembled with groups of people from around the world. We had a whole group of French students, we had Belgians, we had a person from Greece, we had Chinese students, Japanese students. So it was really this tremendous gathering of people that came with spirit. So on the first day of class, Lou came in with Le Ricolet and with Norman Rice and sat down, and he started to talk as the way Lou does, that it was somewhat vague in terms of what he was saying, but the words sounded great and they sounded inspirational. And he told us for the first project to think 17th and Chestnut Street. Stopped right there and kind of ended his talk, and then we all had to start to talk about what it was like with Philadelphia and what our impressions were. The people in that class were so skilled that they could depict anything. This was a time before computers where people were doing hand drawings, so 3-point perspectives. This was their first chance to be in front of Lou. And the drawings on the wall were just mesmerizing. Lou came in, sat down, Le Ricolet at his side, Norman at the other side, and the first student presented. And it was a fantastic set of drawings he had, and Lou just sat there with his head doing this. And everybody looked, how could you be saying that this wasn't fantastic? And Lou said, this has nothing to do with what you told me your intentions were going to be for the project. So this rigor that he had, that you had to make the drawings, make the depiction, match the intention you had, was the whole premise for what the studio was about. The second problem he came in after we did the first one, which is 17th and Chestnut, was the one word, it was a room. And obviously at that point, as we'll see in the presentation on the book, he was grappling with Roosevelt Island and the room at the end. The studio was in effect his think tank, and he would probe and push and poke to see where he could take us to be able to inspire him in terms of how we'd go forward. The room was filled, as you know, it's up in the upper floor above the library, and the room was just a dynamic movement of light through the day. And I was talking to my wife, by the way, we're having a reunion of the whole class. We found 17 of the students out of 22 have been located, and later in October, they're all going to do a virtual Zoom call. Participants from Saudi Arabia all the way through Korea are going to be in this. But my wife and I were talking about what was the salient memory we had from the studio. And I remember sitting on my desk after the whole studio was over, looking out over the city and seeing a tremendous arcing rainbow happen. And my wife said, no. The thing she remembers was that she snuck out of studio a day that I was presenting. And Lou asked me a question, and I turned around and I pointed to my drawing, and at that time, a circle of light came down, beamed, and hit right where the end of my finger point. I turned around to Lou, and he was just smiling from, under those big glasses. It was the end of my presentation. He said, fine, we moved on to the next one. It was just a magical time. The way the studio ran is he would come up from a cab, make his way up the stairs and sit down, And he was at a desk that must have been in the range of like 7 feet by 5 feet. It was gigantic. And he would sit there and he would expound. He would give his thoughts about things he was considering, things he had seen that day, just anything. He was a pure mystic, and we would sit there diligently writing notes and capturing every word that he gave us. And then at an appointed time, he would start the class. And in order to be able to present, you had to tack up your work on a series of travels that went down the middle of the studio. He would not come to do a desk print with you. You had to put on the wall what you were comfortable showing to the world. And he was rigorous, as I said before, in terms of what he demanded of us and how we put things together. So this magical time went on, and we got to spring break, and we all took a chance to go. Some people who hadn't been in America had a chance to be able to go see some things out far west. Some of us went home up to the Northeast. And we all gathered on that Monday morning after spring break to be able to hear where Lou had taken us. The third project, by the way, was North Philadelphia. Just do something with it. There were no programs. We had to invent that and then find a whole cause and defend our notions and then be able to depict them. But Lou didn't show up. Now, fortunately, because of that woman that I met, I had taken a car ride back from New York. Otherwise, I would have been going through Penn Station at the exact same time that would have been able to recognize Lou. My dear friend David Hollenberg, who teaches in the Historic Preservation Department, was in Penn Station. He remembers going down the stairs and seeing a man on the floor and just kind of turned his head and walked away. He would have been able to identify him as well. We went on for 2-3 days not knowing where Lou was. There was constant communication with the office. Nobody could find Lou. And then certainly we began to suspect that something was terribly wrong. We found out that he had passed away. There was a very formal funeral that was held downtown. As best we could, we cleaned up. Remember, this was the 70s, right? And nobody had suits or anything, but we made ourselves, the students, as presentable, and we went down to at least stand in the hallway to be able to hear all the tributes for Lou. That afternoon, remember that we are a Quaker institution. We had a service up in the apse, and people from around the world had gathered there. Buckminster Fuller was standing there, Le Bricolet obviously to the side, the Venturis were there, Denise Scott Brown was there, and a man by the name of Patrick Quinn, who teaches up at RPI, who is an Irishman, was standing up on one of the upper tiers, that overlook. And so the ceremony began, and people certainly spoke about, in a Quaker way, spoke about Lou. And then at one break, this lament and wail came out of the upper tier, and it was Patrick Quinn singing this deep dirge that just moved everybody in the place to tears. In the front of the room, there was on that large desk, there was an amazing array of forsythia. Now, we students had no money, and Fritz's note, and he knows where I'm going with this, so we tapped into a landscape architect that we seemed to know, my wife Alice, and we went out to the whole campus. There was Hill Hall Field across the way that was filled with forsythia. The museum had them, and we had, must have been 12 feet at 6 feet high of forsythia filled in the front of the room to be able to create the ceremony that was there. It was a magical time. I remember Le Bricolet saying, in 2 words, Lou was a man, and just ended it there, just to kind of let us know how important we had been to be in his presence. So with that, I turn it over to 1974 and Sue to talk about what was going on in his private life, what was going on in his professional life. But what I saw is what I'm telling you, the students we all were able to partake in and cherish every moment we had with him. So Sue?
So we got a little run of show here where we're going to talk about this package. We're going to talk about the process of making it. We're going to think about and talk a little bit about notebooks and sketchbooks, look inside the production and the content of the book a little bit, and just end with a star. So I want to do what I do in the archives, and I want to handle this like an object in the archives. And so it's a way of taking you through this as a production. There's 2 pieces to it. There's the facsimile of the notebook, and then there's the,
Commentary.
The commentary. I can't read my handwriting. I'm just off of a plane from Taiwan. There's a commentary volume. So they did a really clever thing with the sketchbook is it's got a slipcover. And so when you take the slipcover up, it looks pretty much exactly like one of the Winsor Newton sketchbooks that Lou Kahn carried all over the place. It doesn't have the Winsor Newton here, which is the black and white sketchbooks. And I wonder if it originally had the black, I think it did. Yeah. Okay, so one thing is there, but it's got the smudge on the cover. Okay? And so one of the things that we learn about Kahn's notebooks is there's often lots of blank pages. And we'll get a little bit into how Kahn used notebooks a little bit later, so I don't want to get ahead of myself in that. But in flipping through, the first drawing is a sketch, one of the first, of the Roosevelt Memorial in New York City, probably from late February, early March. So there's other sketches and there's other pieces of the puzzle elsewhere, but this is how this story begins in this notebook. And it's really quite wonderful because he's figuring out this room at the tip of the island and thinking about it as a large volume that you might be able to enter into. I also love the fact that in the facsimile you can see the smudges from one to the other because he's drawing and he's adding layers into the notebook. So when you're drawing and you haven't done spray fix, it transfers. You go a little farther, there's an empty page, So you're getting his pace, you're getting this kind of movement through space and time, and he's left a little gap here in the progression. You get notes, and this will be one of our vignettes for a lecture. I'm not going to tell you which one, but it's really wonderful how Sue was able to piece this back together, or piece together what's going on this page here. There's another kind of blank page, and then you get some sketches of the Yale Center for British Art. Not the totality of the building, but you get some color sketches of fountain details within courtyards. It wasn't built this way. It's a step along the progress of a larger design. And you have to imagine he's traveling somewhere out in the world between Bangladesh or India or Israel or Iran, all these places that he was traveling in the last year. Remember, we started in February, late February 1973. Another kind of blank page, and then more of that same fountain drawing present on the inside, using a little bit of color. So somewhere he was able to pick up a color pencil and put a little bit of blue here. All right? So now you switch to a red pen, or he does, and he's writing notes for another lecture. And it's just, has he prepared a text before he got to the lecture venue? Maybe not. Maybe on the way he's putting his notes and gathering his thoughts. He often spoke off the cuff on themes that were repeated or variations on themes from lecture to lecture. This is how he's organizing it in this instance. The pen changes, so it's maybe a different talk. And those little signals tell you that you've moved in space and time and you're somewhere else. So we return. Some time has passed since we first saw the Roosevelt Memorial. This is in the summer, maybe August of 1973. So I've taken you on a journey of about 5-6 months. And we revisit the FDR Memorial here. And this is what's presented when the island is rededicated as Roosevelt Island in September 1973. So we then jump in space and time to Iran. I got to get the right, so he's working in Iran, and there's one little sketch. He's making 2 trips in the time period of this sketchbook to a project he's working with the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange, designing an extension to Tehran. So a large urban planning project, right? And then there's a sequence of sketches. This is one of our other vignettes that we're going to look at a little bit more closely, where you see him making a series of drawings for the Roosevelt Memorial. And we're going to talk more about these, so I'm not telling you as much about them. And this is really a wonderful part of this book, because there's nothing like these sketches over in the Kahn archive. Right? And you're seeing him walk around the site with the people who might be visiting the site, seeing it from different vantage points and locations. So I love this little detail where there is a page missing or that's been torn out, and you can see the heavy rendering in the gutter, right? We don't know where that sketch is. We really would love to know, or did he make a drawing and say this isn't good enough and threw it out? We don't know, but something like this allows us to enter that space and time and think about what he was thinking about in the moment. And then you're back to Roosevelt Island, so we're presuming that's part of this sequence of little perspective studies. Right? Going a little further, he leaves us another blank. So take a breather. We've moved. The drawings we just looked at are maybe from January, February 1974. So we've moved now 11 months, and we're to a sequence of 3 drawings from Iran. And this is part of that city planning project for Tehran, Abbasabad. And some wonderful, really dark, rich sketches. And presumably Tanguy is there, and they're having a conversation and adjusting their designs. This is another drawing we're going to come back to, and I'm not going to tell you its story right now, but I want to show you that it's in the sketchbook in this location, all right? And it's a site plan. Just a drawing that shows the contours of the upper part of the site. Much of the work they're doing is down in the bottom area. So what an architect chooses to include and not include in a drawing. And is it finished? That's a wonderful part of a notebook. And then you hit this area where it's a lot of blank pages, except you get this wonderful little, is it a star? Is it a shooting star? It's these kind of, we don't know, but it's where his presence in the book ends. Okay? The second part, the companion?
Commentary.
The commentary.
Companion is fine.
I only brought over a magic marker, and I can't read my own handwriting. So in order to tell that story, you get this volume that helps you with Kahn's handwriting, that tells you some of the details and gives you some context along the way. There's a wonderful essay by Mike Lewis that goes into putting Kahn's use of sketchbooks into a larger context. There's 17 of them. 17 sketchbooks?
I think 18.
18? Okay. So that there's a number of them out there. What I find about the one that Sue chose, it is this wonderful self-contained volume of 1 year at the very end of Kahn's life. It captures this movement, this rhythm, and it captures his way of using sketchbooks and notebooks, which is very different than others. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I didn't think a book project like this would work for that reason. Kahn picked up and put down notebooks and was seemingly not thinking about them in the ways that others do who use notebooks systematically. Like me, where you number everything and you keep these always at your hip and side for particular reasons. Kahn wasn't like that. So how is this thing going to hold together? And it does, because it really evokes his way of being in the world, his presence, in a really quite wonderful and magical way. So
Can I say something?
you may.
I just want to say that the last year of my father's life, I hardly saw him. I was living in New York. He was in Philadelphia, but he was also a world figure at that point, having been a very provincial Philadelphia architect to start. And he was just always traveling. So I would see him at Christmas and other family gatherings, but I didn't see him much. So this book gave me an opportunity to trace his whole last year, day by day, really, researching all of this with Bill's help and help from a lot of other people. And I was able to get very close to my father in this special way. And the book is commemorative. It's the 50 years since his death, which is absolutely astounding to me. I never imagined it was that long because he seems always with me. But it was a wonderful journey to go through this year and see where he was and what he was doing.
We need the slides up.
Just skip through this.
Oh, okay, I got it.
That's the next one. Yep.
Good.
There it is.
Okay. So we've given you a little vignette of looking at the book. And as Richard and Rosanna said, we didn't give you much of an introduction to Lou Kahn. We're assuming that you guys understand, he's born in 1901. He comes to Philadelphia as a young immigrant in 1905. He's educated here in the public schools of Philadelphia and graduates from Central High in 1920. He comes to Penn in September 1920, and he graduates 100 years ago this year in 1924. He's a student at this great time at Penn with Paul Kray, with this incredible focus on Beaux-Arts. So it was really wonderful to hear Richard talk about essentially the esquisse, right? This idea that you approach a project with an idea in mind and you stay true to it. And so his criticism of your classmate was very interesting to see Kahn carrying forth his Penn education throughout his career. Like many architects, he goes to work for his professor and other architects, including a great movie house architect, William Lee. So if you go out to the Anthony Wayne Theater, which sadly I don't think runs movies anymore, that's a project Lou Kahn worked on in 1926-27, works for Paul Kray, and then the Depression hits. So it's very difficult to manage architectural practice in a time when nobody's working. So he's focusing on housing, he's engaging with modernism. He's making a name for himself by working harder than anyone else in the city and finding his way into important circles in design. By the 1940s, he's teaching at Yale first. He starts teaching at Penn in the spring of 1954, which is a year earlier than we thought. Just a short little studio. But that brings him into the circle and orbit of Penn, where he works very closely with Robert Laricolet for the last 20 years of his life. And that's with Richard Farley's comments. That's the kind of the legacy here. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there's this incredible series of projects, including Richard's Medical Research Laboratory, Salk Institute, the India Project, the Bangladesh Project, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the process of the making of the book.
Great. Could we go to the slide that shows the page with all the people's names on
Yep.
So my first delving into what was in this book anyway was this page where he signed the book and dated it. And as far as I know, he never signed or dated any other notebook that he had. And I wondered about the date, May 16th, 1973. So I, of course, asked Bill to send me the calendar page for that week. And it said Brunner Award. I'm looking at the names here that he collected. He collected some info on the left page there. And these were people very important in the New York art scene in 1973. One of whom is still alive, Bill Katz, who's the famous designer of Anselm Kiefer and a lot of other great artists. And he said that was his handwriting, and I think my father borrowed his pen to write his name. I don't know why he did that. Maybe he held the book up so somebody could take a picture of him with it. I don't know. We don't know. But so a Brunner Award. Okay, so Robert Venturi received the Brunner Award that year from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And I thought, well, maybe, I remember talking to you about that, and you said, do we really know he went to New York? I said, well, looks like he was at a party in New York. That's what I got from this page. It sort of has his personality on it. And then there's a kind of writing, silence to light, light to silence. We know that theme, which is now displayed down, what do you call that room?
The mezzanine.
The mezzanine. That was a famous theme of his. So I called the American Academy, and I knew someone there, and she said, give me a minute. I said, I'd like to know if my father actually went. Maybe he was giving a speech or presented the award to Robert Venturi. I'm pretty sure he nominated Robert for the award. He was a member of the Academy and so on. So she comes back, she said, give me 10 minutes. She calls me 10 minutes later, and she said, your father won the gold medal for architecture that day. That was not in the calendar, however, but that's why he was there. And now we can go back to the photograph. So I went to the American Academy. I said, do you have any photographs? I was thinking I might find a photograph with my father carrying the notebook, maybe reading from it. And when this person showed me the printed speech, I realized, in fact, that what we were looking at the previous page was actually the speech he gave to accept the gold medal and the notes from the speech. And so I said, do you have any photographs? They said, well, the archive's closed, and I don't think there's going to be anybody to help you. And 2 days later, they said, come over to the archive and look. And there was a big box there with his name on it, and there were photographs. And though I didn't find a photograph of him reading and, lecturing from this book, I found a photograph at the party afterwards, and he has the book there. That's the very book. And it turns out my mother was there, and I think I was invited too, but I couldn't go for some reason. I was living in New York then. And it's a very odd thing that happened. The whole last year I was working on this book. I had this desire to keep wearing this necklace. And it's nice, it was my mother's, my father gave it to her. And I didn't think anything of it. And then I looked at this photograph very carefully, and I see that she's in fact wearing this. And that gave me some kind of signal that I was on the right track with this book. So I had that experience, finding the photograph of him with the very book, find a picture of Bill Capps there too. He couldn't believe it, but there was a photograph of him too at this party. It's the kind of page, and there are many here, that just had encapsulated my father's personality. And when I would open the book, I would feel very close to my father. And that's why I wanted to share this book as opposed to the other books that I have and the other books that exist. This is very special.
And I loved the idea that you could start to unpack the story of the contents of the notebook, and that's maybe one of the few times where you see Lou actually holding one of his notebooks, which is really exciting. So do you want to talk a little bit more about, how this book happened? How did this production happen, and why now?
Well, I've been trying to interest publishers in this book for over 15 years. And I inherited the book from my mother in 1996 along with other notebooks. And I realized that it had drawings, very important drawings of Roosevelt Island. So I lent the book to a very important exhibition at Cooper Union, 2005, that started actually the process of building the Roosevelt Island Memorial for real. How many of you have been out there in New York? Some. Well, do go.
Oh, we need to schedule a field trip, people.
Yeah, we need. I'll go. I'll meet you there. In any case, Michael Lewis, who wrote the essay for the commentary book, he wrote the catalog for this exhibition, and I lent the book to the exhibition. And he and I were talking, and I said, I really would like to share this book. And I said, if I get it published, I'm going to need an architectural historian to, make this legit, since I'm a musician, I'm not an architectural historian. And he agreed to write the essay. And that was in 2005. So finally I cornered him now that he had to write this. But in any case, 5 years ago, one of the publishers I had tried to interest was Lars Muller, and he turned it down. He said he felt it would be impossible to reproduce this. But then in March 2023, when Michael Lewis had reminded me, actually, he was the one that reminded me that 2024 is a big year. It's the 50th anniversary of your father's death. And I was absolutely stunned to realize that. I said maybe Lars would reconsider and publish this with the idea that it's kind of commemorating this anniversary, which was a nice publicity thing, I thought. And so he agreed to do the impossible. And one of the really challenging things, now this facsimile with its ink smudge is exactly the same size as the original. However, the paper in the original was just like
A little bit thinner.
very much, twice as thin.
No.
This paper here, which is quite translucent and thin, is twice as thick. The thin paper of the original could not go through an offset printing press. So we had to find a paper that had that translucent quality that could still go through a press. And we found the paper, and then there were many, many lithography challenges because my father wrote and drew on both sides of many of the papers. And in the original, where the ink has sort of seeped through, it's very hard to make out because the thing that from the recto side bled into the verso side, and so it was pretty hard to see. So the lithographer had to find just the right amount of light to capture the image on the page, but not so much of the bleed through. So the book was scanned actually twice. And then there was the challenge of the Roosevelt Island drawings that Bill was showing. Those are charcoal. But the Yale drawings, those are pencil. And that's two different blacks, and it's very hard to get that. But I think Lars did a fantastic job of this. And then the original pages are perforated. So, they could be torn out, and we know that he tore out pages frequently from his books. And we don't know what, with most of them. And so it was a very expensive decision, but we decided to have these perforated also, and that had to be done by hand. So you could see that, and Lars is an independent publisher. I don't know whether this could be done in the States so well, but he had tremendous will to make this happen. And I think we're pretty pleased with it.
Yep.
Right? Yeah. So I would say, and then there was another struggle because this is a book that was never meant to be published. It's a private diary, and you might say it's of the most intimate nature because my father was really writing in it and drawing in it for himself. And in a way, it's the most unconscious moment of creating architecture. So there was a struggle, do we publish it? Because it's so private. But I always felt that I, as I said, I felt very close to my father when I would look at it. And this drawing, the red, you showed the lecture.
Yep.
This is for a Penn Wharton lecture, actually, and we have the transcription of what he said, which you can barely sort of figure out from what he wrote. And another fun thing was he said, at the end of the lecture, he said, well, I thought I had a really good idea here. This was after 45 minutes of talking. But he said, I could have closed this book, this very one, and done better. And then he proceeded to show slides of all his work and talk for another hour eloquently. So it was such fun uncovering these things. And I really didn't know what was in here. I didn't pay much attention except I knew about the Roosevelt Island drawings.
But it's that, to me, it's that relationship where you're opening a book, but you're also unpacking a way of being in the world and engaging artistically with the world. So the kind of looking closely at the content of the book and then also piecing together the story, because that's the only way to know what's going on. The connective tissue is elsewhere. It's not in the book itself. Do you want to talk a little bit about sketchbooks and notebooks more generally, or do you have some more that you want to touch on with the production, the making of
No,
the
I
thing?
think it's, I think what you said about my father's haphazard approach to notebooks, whereas you have notebooks from architects and landscape architects that are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and they're carefully documenting everything. There's a notebook that I have that is such fun. It starts with cloud drawings. He was on his way to a lecture in Tulane in 1972. That's how we could date it. And it said he wrote it, he said clouds approaching New Orleans. And he must have been asleep, and then he woke up and all these clouds were there, and there was light streaming through the clouds. And he did a series of rapid drawings, just like the Roosevelt Island drawings, which were done maybe in the space of an hour. Did these 8 fantastic drawings. And it just, ink drawings were great. And then he must have picked the book up later and said, oh, I already drew in this. So he turned it upside down and started in the back and wrote some notes. And then the rest is all blank pages. This is half blank pages, but there's a book in the archive, a Winsor Newton notebook, but it's much bigger. It has the Silence of Light drawings in it. I think there's 3 or 4 pages of drawings. The whole rest is blank. So, this happens to be a very chronological and pretty complete book, which is not a given at all.
Yeah, I mean, in preparing for this evening, I spent a little time with one of the notebooks that I had unpacked some of the story with, and there was lots of sketches related to the Kimball Art Museum, which, I came to discover were in that notebook, were torn out and put on exhibit at the Venice Biennale in 1968, and they've disappeared, right? So, the kind of absences that are within the notebooks are in some ways as exciting as the content in the notebook, but it's this haphazard or very intentional way of picking up a notebook and using it and then leaving it behind and then going and doing something else. So anyone who's visited the archive for one of the tours and you've seen the notebooks, this is something I'm always talking about. There's no right way to use a notebook. It's your way of using the notebook. And so Kahn's way in using this 17, 18 different ones that we know that survive are really quite enlightening about how he used drawing as a tool in his thinking.
Well, there was definitely mind to hand,
Yeah.
which is the architectural process. And I wanted to say that my original idea for the notebook, though Lars isn't sure that that's actually ever going to happen, was that there are so many empty pages that I was hoping whoever of you gets the notebook, that you will then take this notebook, and I know this is a digital age, but this is from the pre-digital age, that you will take this notebook and maybe start from the back and start drawing in it. This paper is pretty good to draw on. I tried it. That's the first thing I tried when Laura said, we're going to use this paper. I thought, well, can you draw on this paper? Because that's what made the Winsor Newton notebooks so great. You could draw on them. And I was always hoping that someone would write their own thoughts, their own poem, their own drawings in it. So anybody who gets this book, I invite you to do it. I hope that you do it.
So when we were speaking about notebooks, you're a musician, and that you were describing seeing notebooks of artists other than architects. You had a nice story. Do you want to share that?
I mean, Beethoven, for instance, said, I always have a notebook with me, day or night, because I may wake up in the middle of the night with this fantastic idea, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget it when I wake up. And so he would grab his notebook and write in it. And the thing about it was so thrilling to see a reproduction of Beethoven's notebooks, because the music staff is 5 lines. You all know that, right? In this notebook, there were lines and lines and lines. There's 17 lines on a page, because he was imagining something very high in a flute or a piccolo, and he was imagining something very, very deep and with a bass or a cello. And there were notes all over the page. And you just got this idea of how the energy of the creation that he was having, and I remember being so thrilled with that. And I also have a facsimile of a Bach flute sonata. I'm a flutist, so this is a piece I know very well and played many times. But there's that sonata in Bach's hand, and I was always thrilled by that. So I'm hoping that getting sort of feeling that you're close to the artist. When you see a private notebook like that, I hope you'll feel the same way about this.
So in the production, did you look at some other facsimiles beyond the ones that you've described in music that were helpful in framing how you approached this and how Lars, thought about, how you collaboratively thought about how to make this work?
Well, I was very fortunate. I was introduced to the chief librarian at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I didn't even know they had a library. That's how, far away from this I was. And I said I was interested in seeing artist sketchbooks, the facsimiles of artist sketchbooks as they had. And he sent me a list of, must be 300. He said, well, what would you like to see? And I said, why don't you pick out some examples of how people do this. There are many, many ways to do a facsimile. He brought me 35 different versions, from Leonardo da Vinci sketchbooks to Bauhaus, the Bauhaus magazine, which is actually a Lars Muller publication. And he took me through the different ways of doing it, and I began to see, and they were all wonderful. I began to see what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do. And there was a Delacroix notebook, it was about this size, and there was a drawing in it. I wish we had a slide of it. I didn't think about that. It could have come right out of this notebook. It was so similar in line, and he was drawing to one of the Iran drawings. And I began to see what I wanted, and I knew that I wanted a facsimile that was like the original, and that it wasn't in the facsimile and the commentary in one volume. We knew we wanted this separate. And this was a process that Lars and I discussed. So I had a lot of help from a lot of different people. It was a very, very steep learning curve and a very fast learning curve, because this book took place and came to completion under a year, which is pretty, including raising the money. So that's pretty fast.
Excellent, excellent. So should we look a little bit inside the book?
Yes, let's look inside the book.
So you already spoke a bit about this as the lecture at the National Academy of Arts and Letters, and you walked us through this. What we were able to do in the archives, though, and it would have been nice to have the calendar page where you could see Brunner, but this was part of your detective story about putting this together, and these are Lou's rewriting of the lecture that he gave for publication, cleaning it up, being able to take his notes and not directly publish what was done, what he said in the room, because maybe they didn't have a recording of it. This was reorganizing it for the experience in a book form. And these are some of the illustrations that you've got in the companion volume. This one you didn't include, which is where he did it quickly, sent it off. They sent it back as an example, and he didn't like what was done, so they cleaned it up, or he cleaned it up, right?
He cleaned it up. He made 9 different versions of this. And in a way, he's constructing language, just the way he was constructing buildings. These notes for speeches, they come out like poetry, but they're also very architectural. And he was very, very clear about how he wanted it presented on the page, how he wanted it to look. And he even started to correct the first notes for his speech, perhaps on the way home. We know that when I was at the Academy, he was asked for a copy of his speech, and he said, this is the recollection of the director of the Academy at the time, which was in this big box of stuff that I found. And he said, well, I can't give you a copy because I wrote it in this little notebook on the way up to New York on the train. So we knew that that was a speech. So they did a photocopy of it, and
I came back to this so that you can make that point.
So page 1 is on the right, and he wrote a 1, and then he wrote a 2 on the left. So every time he would write in this book, he would start on the right side and then go to the left side, and we learned that that was true. And then So they photocopied it so that they could have a copy. But when it came to put it in book form, they couldn't read his writing. So they wrote back to the office and said, we'd like a typed version. And that's when he started to revise. And he made 9 different versions, including the very last typed version. He didn't like it, and the next day sent a fax immediately where he crossed off all the capital letters and made them lowercase, and because it didn't look right to him. So, those of you who understand the series of drawings he would make on an architectural project, and if you haven't seen the book that's up front by Michael Merrill, The Importance of a Drawing, which is another Lars Muller publication, and as small as this is, that's as big as this is. You have to put it on a table to read it. You see a series of drawings and how we would work things out in a series. And he did the same thing when he was writing, almost poetry. I think our dean had mentioned how you were struck by the look of it and the poetry of it.
I just would point out one detail that in your research up at the Academy Archives, the photocopy that they had made at the Academy the night he gave the lecture didn't have this information.
It didn't
right?
have the stuff on the left. It
So
didn't have a signature.
Before he got up on stage, they made a copy, and then he had other people, he met with other people, made notes.
Yeah.
So they actually made a copy of his lecture before he gave it. Right?
Well, no, I think it was before he partied. After he gave it, but before the
Before he
party.
partied.
Before he had a drink in his hand and was
Okay.
partying.
So we have just 2 other examples. One is just to walk you through that sequence related to the Roosevelt Island project, and just an image that helps put it in context in the East River on Roosevelt Island across from the United Nations. And in Sue coming to the archives and unpacking the specific context of the sketches to make sense of it, we dove into the archives. But the pleasure of this, and I alluded to this, is he's walking you around the site. And you have to ask the question, why is he doing that? These are not final drawings. And you're in the room, you're seeing people in the room. There's a close-up, a detail, just to give you a sense of how close he is to what's really built, which is pretty amazing. Stepping back into the room. So he really has an incredible sense of perspective and space, even at this scale. But this was the drawing in the notebook that really helped us unpack. And so when I saw this, and I had never held this notebook, and Sue brought it down to the archives, and we kind of just spent time with it together, I saw this, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. And so I'll get you a little bit closer into the detail, and you can see the Manhattan skyline beyond. And then there's this photograph that we have in the archives. And this is a really odd photograph. This is not a photograph you'd use for anything, except for maybe preparing yourself to make a drawing, a rendering, something that might be related to raising funds for the project, helping introduce this to the public.
I think the model itself is kind of very sterile, even though it's photographed against the New York skyline, which is kind of fun. And then he's really drawing the model. He's saying, okay, here's a model, but this is what's really going to feel like when you're there. And he takes you whole, and that's true of all his renderings. There's always people in them. Of course, these aren't renderings. There's quick sketches. Maybe he made all 8 sketches in the time of an hour. Very quick.
But
And
really,
I just want to say that in the book, you can't see it. It's a little too delicate to see. We also, because the book was closed, and these are charcoal drawings, there was also a shade of the charcoal drawing on the opposite page.
you get a little bit there.
And we reproduced all of those. So you feel that actually it's really charcoal, and it really bled onto the opposite page when the book was closed.
And another image that jumped out at me as we moved through. So, it takes us into the specific moment where the design has evolved enough that they've approved, the clients have approved, they're moving forward, they've made a model, they're going to adjust the model that we just saw and clean it up a bit, but then also preparing a set of drawings that Kahn never made, in a final form what we have or what's in this notebook.
We don't know if they might have been ideas for big presentation drawings. I mean, they're monumental drawings on a very, very small scale. I mean, you feel that they're drawings that should be this big, but he's making them this big. And perhaps he would have, he signed one of them actually. And perhaps he was going to have a big presentation drawing to raise funds to get this project built, because he often had to do that. Here is the signature on the very bottom.
I mean, I think that you guys know that we have some of Paul Cray's drawings, so his professor at Penn in the Architectural Archives, and he also did these very small perspectives for himself as a way of conceiving and thinking of larger drawings. And we have nothing else like this in the Architectural Archives with the Kahn collection. So he's turned it on the side. You're in the room. You're seeing the model. And then we get to this, our third example.
Yeah, this is another cool story. So Michael Lewis and I were at the archives with Bill, and this project in Tehran. It's the last project my father ever accepted. And he had a vision of building a whole city north of Tehran with Kentotangi together that would be as significant as the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And he actually said this to the Iranian architect that was working with them, who is alive and living in Florida, who I talked to. And actually, in the book that I own, this drawing isn't there. It's a ripped out page. So Bill and I and Michael were talking about the Iran projects. We don't know much about this. You even said you didn't know much about this. Michael had never heard of it. I didn't know much about it. I'd done some research. And I said, could we see Lou's drawings of this project? So you brought out a whole big folder of yellow trace drawings, and I mean, big drawings of this project. Actually, this part that's around on the bottom there.
Yeah, much of the drawings focus on this.
Focused on all the buildings there. And the yellow trace drawings were full of color, full of pastel, which is unusual. And we're looking through them, and all of a sudden we see this little white page. And Bill said, that's a notebook page.
It had the perforations on it.
And I said, that's from this notebook, because it is very clear that it preceded this other, the other page that you just said, which was, it showed that there was another drawing like that, but there was a blank page. And we found that what happened, I actually talked to the architect, the Iranian architect who was with my father. And in the archives, when I went to the correspondence, I saw that there was a photocopy of this page, and he was sending it around. He had done, we can date this, he had done this drawing on February 17th, 1974, almost a year from those very first Roosevelt Island drawings. And it was the idea, he had come to Iran to meet Kentotangi. Kentotangi had come with a different kind of idea. My father had come with these yellow trace drawings with the colored thing. And he was putting the two ideas from the two architects together. And Kentotangi said, according to Nader Arvalan, he said, oh, you've drawn yourself. It looks like a person's head. Well, the site is like a person's head. These are the Abruz Mountains up top, and then the city was to be below. And so he had he'd gone to Philadelphia from Iran, ripped the drawing out of the book, and had it photocopied. And sent it around, not annotated, sent it around to Kentotangi in Japan, to Nader also, and to a French developer who was also working with them. And then, why don't you continue this
Yeah, so
saga?
we went to, this is a book done by Aldo Giurgola and Jaimini Mehta, and here's the sketch that was pulled out of the sketchbook. The original sketch was not marked up by Kahn, the photocopy was, and this is what then was put into publication, right? So we don't have a photographic print of this. It might be with the photographs that were made for part of the production of this book. But it's part of the story about how the sketches moved out of the notebooks, were created in the notebooks, and then went on to do other things.
Now, here's the
The
site.
pieces and parts.
Here's the site map. You can see it, like, I don't know if you can see it. It looks like a head, and then the missing page, and then the annotated page. So we knew what he meant by all of this. And it was so thrilling to find this page. I'm hoping that maybe someone else will have another missing page, but Lars and I decided we would put this page back in the book. So whereas my original does not have this page, the facsimile does have it, because it clearly belongs there, and that was a pretty exciting thing.
I think we had to memorialize having the original notebook there and the sketch there, and we put them together to make sure the perforations matched.
Absolutely, we lined up the perforations, and it was exactly right. There's no doubt. And then Nader remembered. He said, oh, yes. He said, I remember your father drew that on the last day he was there in a little black notebook. And I said, Nader, actually, it wasn't black, but it was a notebook. And he remembered that he drew it in the notebook. So we're absolutely certain that it belonged here. And then there's this. And I think that, for me, this is just such a magical, hopeful expression. It's the only thing on the page. It's the last page that he drew. And whether it's a magical wand or a burst of light, we don't know. But I feel that it's a sign of hope and joy and magic. And my father was very, very personable. He could reach out to anybody. He was a very positive person. He loved magic and fairy tales. This reminds me of The Little Prince, although the stars in The Little Prince book, they don't look anything like it, but it's the same feeling. And when I was taking this book around to raise money, which I had to do, we'd get to this page and everybody would go, oh, this is really wonderful. And so this is the way the book that my father leaves you in this book. And I think it's just a very beautiful thing to have this little burst of light. And bye.
Should we leave it at that?
Hmm?
Or do you want the photo?
Yeah, the photo, that's an interesting thing.
Okay.
Now, this is a very, very favorite photo of mine, of my father. And I kind of wanted to show it today because it has to do with architecture and so many students and architects here. And it reminded, Michael Lewis talked about it. It reminded him of the great Raphael painting, The School of Athens, where Plato is looking up at the heavens and Aristotle is pointing down to the earth. And to me, it symbolizes the paradox of architecture, where you are creating the most divine art, but it must be practical at the same time. My father, who thought he was going to be an artist of some kind, a painter probably, until he discovered architecture in the last year of his high school. He took a course in architecture, and that's how he went to Penn to study it. He always used to tell me that Giotto was very lucky because he could paint people bigger than houses, but architects simply couldn't do that. Your building has to be functional. But he managed to do a functional building like the Richards building that was not just ugly and staid and mechanical, but that was beautiful and hopeful. And I just kind of wanted to show that picture because I think that all of us can aspire as architects, even though I'm not one, but certainly my son is one, and my father was one, and so I'm surrounded by many of them. It's a very noble profession, and you must do both. You must seek the highest kind of art, as my father tried to do, and be down to earth and make it practical.
Well, Sue, you're surrounded by architects, and we're all very grateful for you coming and sharing this wonderful book with us, so thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. So we'd be happy to take questions. Does anyone?
Have any?
I have a question. What was your father's reaction when you told him that you wanted to study music?
What was your father's reaction when you told him you were going to study music?
Well, I was doing music since I was 3 or 4 years old, so it wasn't anything surprising. And he himself was very musical. He played the piano, and he had a lot of musical talent. There's a lot of musical talent in my family. And he always supported that. And he would come to my concerts and be quite critical about that. He'd listen. He'd say, I think you dropped the end of your phrases a bit, and things like that. And at one point, I didn't want to go to my lesson. I said, I'm sick. He said, are you really sick, or did you just not practice? So I had to admit I had just not practiced, and he took me off to the lesson anyway. He was very supportive, and music was very important. I mean, in my family, my mother's side and my father's side, the highest thing you could do was be an artist of some kind, music or art, visual arts. And if you couldn't do that, you had to help people. You had to be a social worker or somebody like that. So music was a given. And my mother had 2 cousins who were musicians, professional musicians. So it was just never a thought of it. My mother wanted me to get my PhD and have some security. But she was disappointed in that. I gave it up.
Did he ever play with you?
Pardon?
Did he ever play the piano?
Well,
and
we
accompany
would
you?
play the piano together because I studied piano before I became a flutist. We would play the piano at parties, and we would play something like chopsticks. So I would be doing the da, 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 and he would be going all over the keyboard with improvisation. And he would always sort of kid me because he didn't really read music. He didn't play for music, whereas I was like very studious, and that's how I could edit something like this. I was like the dogged one, and he was the creative one. So we had fun. Yes, Fritz.
You mentioned that he's very much a Philadelphian who became a global citizen, but he wasn't from Philadelphia originally.
Well, he emigrated from Estonia to Philadelphia.
So what kind of imprint or the immigrant experience and the experience of coming from the politics had on him?
He was 5 when he got here, I guess.
Yep.
And I don't know. I don't know if that's what made him such a global figure. He was a global figure when he died. When he died, he had the projects he had going. The Bangladesh Parliament building was under construction, and we'd just seen that in the newspapers for the backdrop of the Bangladesh riots recently. He had 2 projects going on in Jerusalem, which is, I'm not exactly answering your question, but it's an interesting thing what happened to him, because he became a global figure. He had the Horva Synagogue and a Government Hill project. He had a project in Rabat, Morocco. There was a project in Nepal that was finished after his death. The Indian Institute of Management, which was mostly built, he was still designing that. His very last drawing, in another notebook, not this one, was of a conference center there. He had projects all over the United States. The Yale Art Gallery, the British Center for British Art, was under construction. He had the Demi Neal Center in Texas that he was designing. He had a seminary in Berkeley. He was going all over the country. At a time, 1973, architects didn't do that. Corbusier did to a certain extent. But the architects that go around now and build in China and build everywhere, that wasn't the case. And traveling wasn't as easy as it did now. And I think in a way it contributed to his sort of untimely death, because it was a tremendous thing. He was all over the globe his last few years. And I think for some reason, I don't know whether it was because he was an immigrant himself and his father spoke many, many languages, that he could connect with anybody in any language. He could immediately find a human connection. And he loved to talk to people. It didn't matter where they were from, what language they were speaking, how old they were. And I think maybe he got that from his parents, but he was just always that way.
Other questions?
Yes.
I think the last time I met you, I may have mentioned that we were the architects that renovated Richard's medical building,
Yes.
which was a wonderful commission for us to pick up on, a spectacular commission for your father. And in researching for it, because I just gave a scup talk about it, I found out how pained Kahn was in reading all the value engineering aspects that were cut out of the project, which gave him great anxiety. And I think this is such a great photograph to look at, because the visionary and the practical. And I wonder, in any of the other notebooks, is there anything about the practical that's in it? Because the wonderful thing about this notebook, it's so aspirational, and as an architect, we'd like to focus on aspirational, and we are constantly dragged down by practical. So I'd like to know, where does Kahn reflect his feelings about the need to be grounded in some of the projects that he had?
I think that's for Bill to answer. I love the use of the word aspirational, because I think that's what this is all about. I think that's right.
I would just say it's almost always both, right? It's making me think of sketchbooks where Kahn is drawing form work on the site when they're doing the tests for the form work at the Salk. And he's drawing literally what they're doing to cast the concrete so that he can make a record of that. But then you also see there's other layers where he's moving beyond that almost as soon as he's making the sketch. So you have that. There's a sketchbook where throughout the sketchbook he's rewriting a letter about the importance of master planning and trying to get a principle across to a client. And he's writing and rewriting and making sure he's making a connection on a very practical matter. And we have the carbon copy of that in the archives. So it's fun to see, like the lecture, the persistence and the trying to get something clear. In this case, a letter to a client trying to get them to be supportive versus a lecture where he's dialing in a bigger idea. So there's a range in the sketchbooks for sure.
I want to say that without the Architectural Archives at Penn, it would be impossible to have done this. Just make a plug for this wonderful resource you have at this university. And without Bill's help and Heather at that time, who was the archivist, it would be inconceivable to have done this, certainly in under a year, inconceivable. So this is a Penn thing, made possible by what you have on this campus.
Other questions? Please.
I am curious about one specific design of Kahn around this time, 1962. He took the commission of the chemistry building of University of Virginia. And the design, I think, I went to the archives a couple of times just looking into the drawings. There were dates, and the span was from like the early 1962 to late 1963. So it's a quite long design process, but eventually it was not built on the campus. And I wonder if, do you know any stories about that?
No.
It didn't get built. But I mean, for Kahn, the search and the design development process it's pretty vivid in that project. And it's interesting to see him paralleling different, to put it in very simple terms, kind of building types. right? So the laboratory and a place of science that's a school at the same time, and to see how he's driving through drawing and models to figure out exactly how those relationships can be articulated in that specific place, right? So, I mean, there's a great value to Kahn's unbuilt design work for the quality of the search that goes into it. And because he's both that and that, that aspiration to things that transcend the individuality of a brilliant designer and are the way that really great architecture connects with the people who spend time there living, working, doing things, and how do you make that work? So, but you were at school in 1962, right? So,
Yeah.
okay. Other questions? Please.
So, thank you for the great talk and then bringing this nice little book. I just
I
wanted,
can't
you
hear.
mentioned the original paper is half thinner than this one. Did like Kahn bought it somewhere or is kind of a custom?
So he's asking about the paper and the sketchbooks and like where he might have gotten the sketchbooks.
He bought the sketchbooks around the corner from his office at, what
Was
it?
Taw's?
Taw's.
Was it Taw's?
Yeah, Taw's art place.
No, it's well, come to the archives and you can see. But it's when I was a student, they still were selling those notebooks. So of course I'm geeking out on Kahn, so I had to buy the same notebooks. But it's a very thin paper and it's really interesting to draw on. It's a very smooth paper and it takes pencil very nicely. But the thinness of the paper is something to contend with. But it's a beautiful paper.
Yeah, I think he drew in a number of different kinds of notebooks, but by the 1960s, he pretty much settled on these. And they're Winsor Newton notebooks of different sizes in the archive.
Right.
I know there's that big one.
There's almost none that are the same size, which is really remarkable.
And none that have the same number of blank pages either,
Right.
but they all have them.
Yeah.
Most of them have them.
So maybe time for one more question.
What's the biggest challenge of putting this last notebook together?
What's the biggest challenge of this project and putting the project together?
I think the biggest challenge was that I've never produced a book. I know nothing about the facsimile process. And there was a tremendous fast learning curve. However, because Lars Muller is the publisher that he is, I couldn't have wished for better. And I'm glad that over the last 15 years, I couldn't find anybody else to do this, because I don't think it would have come out nearly as happily as it did. And there were many, many challenges. I mean, you have to, this is the same size as the original, so you have to get the number of pages right. And these pages come in groups of sets of and then the paper, which this is translucent, you can still see your fingers through this. So you wanted to have the feeling of the original. That was so important. And then all the research, that was very, very challenging, because I'm not an architectural scholar. I'm a musician. I know nothing about books. But I learned. It was a fantastic journey and helped by a lot of people. So I think the challenge was also putting this together in a year so that it really came out. We had our first book launch the day after, 50 years plus one, to the day that he died. So that was pretty special.
All right, maybe one more.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this as an architecture student. It was really nice and such a privilege to give us this gift, and it was really brave to show us notebook. And I was wondering, are there any other projects you're working on right now?
Do you have other projects in mind now that you've done a book?
One and done.
Sue has done an amazing job, along with her brother and sister, in being great voices for stewardship about Kahn's architecture, in helping make sure that people recognize its significance, and when they don't, helping rally the troops to make sure that this incredible heritage of built work remains. So thank you for so many things, and thank you for being here at the Weitzman School tonight.
Thank you.